Economics Department of Women University. I'm Dr. Alia Khan. I'm a retired professor of economics from Quaid-e-Azam University and a former dean, Faculty of Social Sciences from Quaid-e-Azam University. But I've had a close association with Fatma Jinnah Women University by way of being teaching faculty and also syndicate member for 2 terms. It is my honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Lant Pritchett, who, as Faiza said, is best known as a development economist. And Dr. Pritchett received his PhD in economics from MIT in 1988. He worked with the World Bank from 1988 to 2007 and contributed to many world development reports, and some of which are the World Development Report 1994, Infrastructure for Development, the World Bank, the World Development Report 2004, Making Services Work for the Poor, and also a landmark World Development report, not World Development, a World Bank report of 2005 titled Economic Growth in the 1990s, Learning from a Decade of Reforms. And he has also taught at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government from 2000 to 2019. Currently, Dr. Lant Pritchett is affiliated with Oxford's Blavatnik School of Government as the research director of the RISE program. And for people who do not know the acronym RISE, it is Research on Improving Systems of Education. He is also research director at Lant, which stands for Labor Mobility Partnerships, and a fellow at the London School of Economics. In addition, he is a consultant to Google.org, is a non-resident fellow of the Center for Global Development in DC, and is a senior fellow of BREAD. BREAD is an acronym for Bureau of Research and Economic Analysis of Development. Dr. Pritchett has co-authored many seminal books, and 2 of those books are Building State Capability, Evidence Analysis and Action, and Deals and Development. The Political Dynamics of Growth episodes. Both have been published by the Center for Global Development. And he has published his sole authored book is Let Their People Come, Breaking the Deadlock in International Mobility. So you can see that his co-authored books and his own authored book span a lot of topics. And his other well-known book is, which he authored solely, is The Rebirth of Education, which was published in 2013. He has published over 100 journal articles, working papers, chapters, and books, working with over 50 different co-authors. His publications span a wide range of development topics: economic growth, state capability, education, labor mobility, development assistance, and many more. His published work has over 48,000 citations. And I'm sure the students and the young faculty who are listening to this are going to be greatly enriched by his keynote address today, which is on sustained versus sustainable development, Pakistan at crossroads. Pakistan is at crossroads for many reasons today, but this is indeed one of the important facets of Pakistan being at the crossroads as to whether Pakistan can achieve sustainable development without having sustained growth. And I now invite Dr. Lant Pritchett to shed light on this topic through his very, I'm sure, thought-provoking and engaging international keynote address to this conference. So Dr. Lant Pritchett, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. It makes me sound very busy. I have to say all those things have been spaced out over a very long career. I'm happy today to talk about this particular topic, which is one I have in some sense avoided talking about, but when invited to talk about sustainable development, I thought it was important to clarify some very key things. So I'm going to share a screen with a presentation that I prepared specifically for this keynote. So slideshow. There we are. Everyone can see the presentation now?
Yes, it is visible very nicely. Thank you.
Good. So, so I'd like to make 4 major points that I think help frame the issue of sort of the topic of sustainable development and what it might mean, and how a country, and I'm going to speak in some sense very little directly about Pakistan, because I think everyone listening in knows as much or more about Pakistan than I do. I'm not an expert on Pakistan. I'm much more an expert on more generic and general issues about development, and I think these are conceptual framing issues. So first, I want to make the point that for developing countries to make progress on improving human material well-being, and I want to focus that this is material well-being. There are other dimensions to well-being, but on material well-being, that first of all, sort of the process of national development, which is a 4-fold transformation that includes economic growth, is absolutely essential to progress. It is not as if there is significant scope for progress in material well-being outside of an overall process of national development. The second is, and this is in some sense the key challenge for developing countries, is that the process of economic growth is episodic. That is, rather than growth being a relatively steady, predictable process that might be slightly faster or slightly slower, as it has been historically for the OECD countries, economic growth in the developing countries, the challenge has been not in some sense to create the growth is episodic, and the challenge is not to create episodes of rapid growth. Creating short bursts of rapid growth has actually been quite common. It's that with the challenge of episodic growth, the challenge is sustained growth. That is, to have sustained periods in which one has rapid convergent growth. And in the challenge of sustained growth, sustainability issues, as normally construed, are just one component. And an important, maybe the important question is how large and important in the overall process of maintaining sustained growth are sustainability issues. Are sustainability issues a major challenge or actually a relatively minor challenge of the overall challenge of creating sustained growth. So that's a second sort of large conceptual point I'm going to make. And each of these I'll go into in some depth. The third is that sustainability sometimes seems to be construed as a process of stasis or maintenance or preservation. And I want to be clear that in the overall concept of sustainability, it doesn't necessarily mean a preserving of natural resources. It means a preserving of the stock of productive assets, and that the overall stock of a country's productive assets could involve running down some natural resources and the depletion of some natural resources in the context of an overall maintenance of sustainable productivity. And hence, the issues of sustainability that need to be focused on are often very specific issues of which are the specific elements around environment and natural resources that are essential, and which are the ones that have a dynamic of in which sustaining of the actual stock of a specific resource is important. And I'll explicate, I think, what that means. And then finally, I think just entirely too much when the word sustainable is used, it's referring to one of many, many sustainable issues, which is climate change. And I just want to be clear that while climate change may pose issues of sustainability to Pakistan, nothing that Pakistan does or does not do about the carbon intensity of its growth or the greenness of its growth has anything to do with the impact of climate change on the people of Pakistan. Ultimately, it may well be that climate change poses very severe challenges to Pakistan's growth process, but the extent to which climate change impinges on the growth process of Pakistan is completely beyond the control of Pakistan. And so the real issues for Pakistan around climate change may not, in fact, have anything to do with the carbon emissions of Pakistan. As I said, each of the four of these is potentially controversial, and I just want to be clear that we have a conceptual foundation in discussing sustainable growth. So let me start with the first of these topics, which is second on controlling. So point one is I want to start by, in the context of a discussion of sustainable growth, make sure that we're actually talking about the centrality of growth itself. I think particularly emanating from what one calls the West or the North or OECD countries generally, there's a significant argument these days against economic growth as a key political or a key policy objective, a key social or normative objective. There's significant pushback that any economic growth is in and of itself important as an objective. And I want to be clear that, if you're Germany or France or New Zealand and you have GDP per capita that's very high, like, I have no strong feelings about whether or not, economic growth should be an objective of the government of New Zealand. I use New Zealand as an example because they politically announced that they're no longer have GDP per capita growth as an objective. However, this anti-growth intellectual milieu or even agnostic growth that, well, we don't really need growth in order to improve, this kind of anti-growth agenda has seeped into development agencies funded and run by the West and in development economics itself. And there are many now argue that high levels of human well-being can be achieved without economic growth. And I want to make a very strongly, starting with any discussion of sustainable growth, if we want to talk about sustainable growth, we need to acknowledge and prioritize growth. And any stance that growth itself isn't a super important objective and in fact essential to improving human well-being is just factually wrong, and often leads people promoting this view in my view to be seriously morally wrong. So let me just sort of make this first overall point about the centrality of growth to human well-being with sort of 4 graphs that I think help actually ground why just demonstrate the fact that economic growth is very important for the developing countries. And that kind of illustrates just 4 facts. First fact is, in any discussion of economic growth, we need to start from the premise that the gap between the current level of GDP per capita of the rich and poor countries is still enormous, and that the current poor countries are still very much at a level of GDP per capita in which the rich countries themselves had no qualms and no debate about whether or not growth was central. So we shouldn't get caught up in a debate about whether today growth is essential. We should be acknowledging that today economic growth is essential for the developing countries in a way it was absolutely essential for the rich countries when they had their current historical levels of GDP. And I'll show you what I mean in a minute. Second graph is, if you construct any measure of well-being, national development is not just a correlate of it, but it's by far and away the dominant thing. It's just empirically necessary and sufficient to have national development, to have high levels of human well-being. Third, this is even more true if one take the basics of material well-being, and I'll talk more about what basics might mean. It's super strongly correlated with GDP per capita. Again, it's not that it's partly correlated or mildly correlated or somewhat correlated. It's just overwhelming that the dominant feature of achieving the basics of human material well-being is associated with GDP per capita. And finally, the same is true of poverty. While many people are discussing programmatic ways of changing poverty rates or transfer programs or particular poverty programs, by and large, those play zero role in the actual evolution of poverty. So the idea that one can significantly reduce poverty without growth is, again, very popular, very rhetorically attractive, but completely, totally false. So the first graph is just showing for the evolution of GDP per capita over time relative to the spread of GDP per capita today. So on the sort of x-axis is evolution of GDP per capita since, and it goes back to 1870, which is roughly when modern economic growth spread and became entrenched in the OECD countries. And the orange line shows the evolution of GDP per capita of the leading 3 countries at any particular time. And so in some sense, illustrates the frontier of what's possible. And on the sort of far right, I show the distribution of GDP per capita today. And so the box plot on the far right of this graph shows the distribution of GDP per capita among the sort of 112 developing countries in 2018. So not exactly contemporaneous, but this is roughly accurate. And the main point is that the median developing country in the world today sort of has a GDP per capita and purchasing power parity of $6,000, and that was the level that the leading countries, that's a lower level of GDP per capita than the richest 3 countries had in the year 1900. So the typical poor country in the world, or the typical developing country in the world, actually has a level of GDP per capita roughly that of the leading countries in the world 120 years ago. And the reason that is an important fact to ground every discussion of the priority of growth is that no one believed in 1900 or believes today that the level of GDP of the rich countries in 1900 was adequate and there wasn't any further need for progress. So whereas today, from the perspective of GDP per capita of $50,000 or $40,000, there is significant intellectual pushback against the need for further economic growth, we shouldn't let anything about that discussion of whether further progress is needed from the very top of this hockey stick graph that shows the cumulative progress over the last 120 years, that should have zero relevance to debates about the priority of economic growth for countries that are now situated very near the levels that these countries enjoyed in the over 100 years ago. Because over 100 years ago, there was no question that the overall aggregate increase in productivity was essential, and in fact was essential, and it has been central to the increase in well-being. So I just want to situate that we shouldn't discuss as if the current contemporary debate is at all equally situated and that countries should all have a very similar priority. It obviously should be a radically different priority for economic growth if you're currently at 6,000 or 7,000 and 8,000. And for countries at those levels today, they should be sort of equally prioritizing growth as the historically the now rich countries did. The second thing is many of the people that are arguing against the priority of economic growth and the overall transformation of national development in favor of specific programmatic approaches just, again, are factually wrong about how central national development is. And what do I mean? I want to be a little clear what I mean by national development and how that relates to any measure of social progress. So what I mean by national development is there's a fourfold transformation of the overall national situation that includes a transformation. The development process has these four components. One is a transformation from low productivity to high productivity, which is basically what is measured by the growth of GDP per capita. One is that countries transform from having relatively low administrative capability, particularly but not exclusively in governments, so kind of a state capability component of national development. The third is that there's a transformation from basically subject to citizen, that the state and those who control the political apparatus of the state become more responsive to the needs, wishes, and wants of their citizens, so a more responsive state. And finally, a dimension of sort of a transformation towards equality and equal treatment of the rule of law across all individuals. So that's the sort of fourfold transformation that I call national development. And I call that national development because each of those four processes isn't an individualized process of individuals. It's an aggregate process that happens at the level mostly of a country or nation. Then the original impetus, and I think the legitimate still impetus of a development should be about national development, because it was always believed that national development, if one achieved higher productivity, higher state capability, a more responsive state, and more equal treatment, that would lead to higher levels of individual well-being. That proposition that national development in and of itself leads to high levels of human well-being is dramatically true today. And so what I did in a recent paper is I took a measure of social progress, the Social Progress Index, and the Social Progress Index was actually calculated and created by an NGO who thought the development process overestimated the importance of economic growth. And so they constructed a measure of social progress that was completely independent of any economic measure. No measure of GDP, no measure of income, no measure of poverty, no measure of any money metric. It was all based on physical indicators of social progress, because they thought that what should be focused on was these, individual measures of well-being. It turns out that if one takes their measure and asks, well, okay, how much of their measure that is completely free of any measure of national development as a component and measured component, but is strictly focused on their vision of what improves human well-being, how strongly is that associated with national development? And so I just create a simple regression association between these two variables, and then calculate sort of the level of social progress at any given level of national development. And this relatively unique graph expresses the range of outcomes that we observe in the world. So within this sort of envelope is the entire range of experiences of countries at similar levels of national development. And in this graph, what's really important is the white space, is the space in which there is no country. And what is really striking is there's nobody in the northeast of this graph. No country achieves high levels of social progress without high levels of national development. Nobody is sort of up enjoying the levels of well-being commonly enjoyed in the OECD without have also achieving the very high levels of this fourfold transformation of national development. And conversely, the converse is also true. No one is in the southeast of this graph. No one has high levels of national development without simultaneously producing high levels of this measure of social progress. And this relationship is very strong and very tight in the sense that the white space is the dominant part of this graph, which means that high level, it's absolutely an empirically necessary and empirically sufficient condition for achieving high levels of human well-being to achieve high levels of national development. So anyone that is saying, well, we don't really need to have this overall national development, through appropriate policies and programmatic efforts, we can achieve high levels of human well-being, they're just factually wrong. It just has never happened. No country has been outside of this very limiting envelope of what is possible at any given level of national development. And so one should expect that the only path to high levels of human well-being is through the process of national development. There's just, again, no demonstrated counterexample to that proposition. The second, the third graph I want to show, and I keep losing my control. So national development, again, is these three, I only have three empirical indicators: state capability, economic growth, and responsive state jointly. And we can come back in the Q&A how much each of those contributes. But the second thing I want to emphasize is that suppose I don't take all of human well-being, but I really focus on the basics. And what I mean by the basics are elements of health, education, access to sanitation, access to water, access to the true core, kind of generally agreed upon elements of basics. And the point of this second paper, which again recently completed in this year, is to say, look, if we take any measure of basics, it doesn't really matter. You know, there's a lot of debate over, geez, how would we frame an indicator? Well, it turns out, for a variety of technical reasons, it really doesn't matter that much, because most of these elements of basics are so highly correlated amongst themselves that any index of basics has this basic property. And so I take sort of a variety of measures of basics and show that all of them have very much this same sort of curvilinear relationship with GDP per capita, in which the achievement of the basics of well-being is super strongly correlated with expansions of GDP per capita at low levels of GDP per capita. Again, if one gets up around GDP per capita of 40,000, this relationship tapers off, and the responsiveness of incremental growth to achieving the basics gets quite flat. But that only gets quite flat at these very high levels. Up and until these very high levels of GDP per capita, and particularly at the levels of GDP per capita where Pakistan now is, the absolute path towards higher achievement of basics comes through achieving higher levels of GDP per capita. And again, the suggestion that it's possible to achieve high levels of basics of human well-being without getting to quite high levels of GDP per capita, and again, much, much higher than currently in Pakistan. Pakistan is in the very steep part of that relationship. Again, it's just not a viable proposition to assert that one can have and be very high in the north dimension of having achieved basics without being very high in the east dimension of this graph without GDP per capita. So sustained growth is in fact central both to achieving aggregate well-being and even more particularly absolutely central to achieving what everyone regards as a core set of basics of well-being. The last point I want to make is that oftentimes in development economics today, there's a lot of discussion and attention to poverty programs. And organizations like JPAL have made the just enormously false but otherwise politically attractive claim that targeted programs are equally important to reducing poverty as economic growth. And that's just false by probably 2 orders of magnitude. If one looks at the left-hand side of this diagram, this is just the simple association between a sort of nonlinear relationship between the median income of the typical individual in the country and period and the rate of poverty in that country and period. So this is data on the left-hand side of both countries' levels, but country levels both across countries and over time. And again, what I want to emphasize is this isn't like there's some association. It's completely dominant. The association between the median, what happens to the typical individual in a country and what happens to the poverty rate, the R squared is 0.988. I mean, the correlation between the sort of index of GDP of the index of median income and poverty is like 0.99. It's just all of the variation in poverty is associated with the variation in the median. And the left-hand graph shows that relationship in levels, and the right-hand graph shows that association changes over time. So if one looks at whether or not poverty has been reduced over time, over the longest possible period of observation, and the growth in median income, again, the association is just enormously strong. So again, the idea that individual poverty programs that countries do or do not implement plays a dominant or even a significant role in poverty reduction is just empirically false. The way in which aggregate headcount poverty is reduced is through the process of a generic increase in the typical individual, which is associated with economic growth. There just is no other path to reduction of poverty other than through growth. And while programs can play some role at the margin, it's just not the case one can, again, drive down poverty rates on the vertical axis without a process of having increased the income of the typical or median of the distribution, which is, again, only through a process of aggregate national economic growth. So, and I just want to emphasize this because in many of the discussions of sustainable growth, I feel that the emphasis is on the adjective, which is sustainable, rather than on the noun, which is growth. And the noun is actually the most important thing. Sustainable non-growth is not a near substitute for sustainable growth. If you don't have growth, whether or not that non-growth is sustainable or not isn't really that important. I sort of think like a brown horse and a black horse are both really similar. But a black horse and a black unicorn are radically different. So if one wants to talk about sustainable growth, I just want to be sure that at the center of this vision of sustainable growth is a vision of sustained growth, that growth is sustained over time in a way that increases aggregate economic activity. And any discussion of sustainable growth that gets fixated on the adjective of whether or not it's sustainable without being fixated on the actual noun, the actual reality of growth, I think is just radically misleading. And I think there's a lot, the reason I'm being so strong about this is there is a lot of intellectual impetus around the world to act as if in order to achieve the sustainable, we need to suppress the growth, but suppressing growth in order to achieve sustainable is not a viable option for increasing or improving human well-being in the developing world at all. And whatever the rich countries want to do about their own growth process is their own business, but they should never retroject onto the developing country reality the pressing need for growth. And to be growth and to be a large transformative growth, it needs to be sustained over extended periods at rapid and converging rates. So I skipped a slide there. So the second is that, again, many of the global discussions of growth start from the OECD reality. They don't really start from a developing country reality. And the biggest difference between the OECD and the developing countries is the nature of the dynamics of the growth process. The OECD the nature of the OECD growth process and the cause of the hockey stick nature of radically increased levels of GDP per capita that we observed in the first diagram was that they had very sustained, but actually quite slow relative to current possibilities growth. So the rich countries are the rich countries because over a process of 120 years or more, they sustained 2% GDP per capita. Relative to that, the challenge for the developing countries is sustaining the growth. So the development country growth process is very episodic, in which countries experience both episodes of rapid growth, and it's not that episodes of rapid growth are in fact enormously rare among developing countries. They are in fact quite common to have episodes of rapid growth. But what is rare is the sustained nature of that growth, because what happens is most developing countries are caught in a dynamic in which they have periods and episodes of very rapid growth, and accompanied, however, by periods of stagnation and periods even of massive retrogression. So over longer periods, the growth process doesn't lead to rapid and sustained transformation. It leads to a period of cycling back and forth between episodes of very rapid growth and episodes of often very slow or even very negative growth. And I say this because, again, in discussions of sustainable growth, people have kind of this mental model by analogy that economic growth itself is this very stable process that gets tweaked like temperature in a room with a thermostat, that there's some linear control variables called policies that lead growth to be slightly higher or slightly lower. And the key policy debate is where we set this thermostat to achieve what is otherwise, and even with the tweaks of policy, is a very stable process. That, in fact, again, reasonably describes the growth process of many OECD countries, but it's radically different. And a much better mental model for thinking about economic growth in developing countries is what I call phase transitions. And a phase transition is where the whole dynamics of a process changes over time. So for instance, water, H2O, if it's below 0 degrees centigrade, it's in a solid state, it's ice, it's fixed, it's solid. Its dynamics are that it doesn't move around and the individual molecules are locked relative to each other. And then as ice goes from less than 0 degrees centigrade to more than 0 degrees centigrade, it melts and it changes its dynamics entirely and it becomes water. And as water, it has a whole different nature and a whole different dynamics. So the way of thinking about the growth process in developing countries is not that we tweak it slightly, but it's roughly the same. The process of economic growth in developing countries is often that there are these very sharp and very discrete episodes in which there isn't sustained growth, in which growth goes from being present to being entirely absent and stays absent for a little. And so I want to just show again a few illustrations of what I mean by sustained growth. So I want to start with if one looks at the long historical progress of the OECD, what characterizes it is this very incredibly stable growth process. So if one were to predict Denmark's GDP in 2003 from Denmark's GDP 100 years previously, just by taking the simplest possible extrapolation of growth over the sort of 11 years from 1890 to 1901, and then just extrapolated forward in the future, turns out one would predict Danish GDP 100 years in advance, almost exactly. The predicted GDP from this simple 11-year extrapolation 100 years in advance would be off by a few percent. And the reason for that is this underlying growth process of Denmark was a sort of 2%, roughly 2% GDP. And nearly every OECD country shares something like this long-term historical process. And that's, in some sense, why they are rich today. But I want to show you what a set of pictures about the growth process looks like. And these were done together with Salim Rahan, who's joining us. We created a handbook of economic growth in which we try to illustrate the difference in the growth process. And so this is, the Netherlands, and this is their growth from 1950 to 2010. And as if you look at the upper left-hand graph, you see this very stable growth rate where nearly all of the growth process is explained by a single stable linear trend. And that linear trend was at about 2% per capita. So if one looks at the Northeast diagram, one sees that Netherlands stayed relative to other countries exactly where it was because the average growth was 2% and Netherlands grew at a very steady 2% over this period. If you look at the Southwest graph, it shows the variability over time of growth, and nearly all of the growth episodes of Netherlands fall within this very narrow bound. And if one takes a distribution of all of the overlapping 5-year episodes of growth of the Netherlands, you see that the Netherlands spent, and then you break growth up into sort of 5 different or 6 different levels, sort of less than 2% collapse, negative growth of 0 to -2, growth of, modest growth between 0 and 2, growth between 2 and 4, growth higher than 4 to 6 and greater than 6. So you take the distribution of which of these 5 categories which of these 5 categories Netherlands is in. The very high bar illustrates that Netherlands nearly all its growth episodes was concentrated in this very narrow range of moderate growth of 0 to 2 or growth of 0 to 4. They had very little episodes of rapid growth, very little episodes. In contrast, Brazil is in some ways illustrates the opposite process, which is although Brazil grew on average at about 2%, it grew on average at 2%, not by sustained 2% growth, but by having episodes of very rapid growth and episodes of very slow growth. So again, the Northeast graph shows the evolution of GDP per capita, and what you see is the green line is the actual evolution of Brazil's GDP per capita, and the dotted line would be a steady growth rate. And what you see is instead of a steady growth rate, Brazil had episodes of very rapid growth in which the green line is much steeper than the process, and then episodes and extended episodes, not 5 years or 6 years, but 20 years over which Brazil had 0 per capita growth. So an extended period that lacked any sustained growth at all. And hence, if you look down in the Southeast graph, you see that rather than Brazil's growth of episodes being concentrated in this very narrow range of sustained rapid growth, Brazil had some very rapid episodes and some very negative episodes. And so the process of growth in Brazil wasn't sustained growth. It was the opposite of sustained growth. It was episodes of very rapid growth, episodes of collapse, which resulted, again, over a long period in some progress, but but growth process wasn't sustained. It wasn't sustained at a rapid level. So whereas I'm just emphasizing that people think that there are countries with rapid growth and countries with slow growth, that's actually the exception rather than the rule. So again, this takes the sort of the possibility of episodic growth and shows how countries spend significant portion, and we take the proportion of the time countries spent in these various 6 categories, from collapsing growth of less than 2%, of -2% per annum or less, stagnation, slow growth, moderate growth, rapid growth, or in a very rapid boom. And one sees there are, again, in the bottom rows, some countries, some very few countries like Botswana, Korea, Taiwan, that we've all heard about, that spent nearly all of their times in the episodes of rapid growth or boom. There are also countries that have had relatively disastrous growth performance, like Haiti and Liberia and Somalia, that spent most of their time as stagnators and collapses. But what most countries in the developing world did is spent time in boom or bust. They spent time both in episodes of rapid growth. So you see Brazil had 6% of all the 5-year episodes were spent in rapid growth, but it was also the case that 10% of the 5-year growth episodes were spent in stagnation. So they had the range of experience. So, and then what that means is, if we want to ask what accounts for whether countries had, over the entire historical period, sustained rapid growth of the type that could create sustained progress in human well-being, it turns out how much time countries spent in these various episodic periods, it determines their overall progress. So what we do, and again, this is work we did together with Salim, is that we try to decompose each country's in the world's growth experience into relative to its expected growth. And by expected growth, we mean the growth that would be expected for a country with its growth history and current level. Relative to the expected growth, was the growth faster or slower? And then we could decompose into discrete episodes of growth how much progress was made relative to the expected.
Dr. Pritchett, I hate to interrupt you, but if you could speed up and conclude in about 10 minutes.
Sure. I am on trajectory to do that.
Thank you.
Let me get a, just a second. Sorry, I needed a clock because I'm seeing my screen and myself, but I'm not seeing a clock. So seeing a clock will help me say. So all of this is just headed towards, I think, the hugely important conceptual distinction between sustained growth. And if your emphasis on sustained growth, there's this that involve creating conditions for a series of favorable episodes, and acknowledgement that the long run is a series of short and medium runs. And second, that if your emphasis on sustained growth, you realize that there are many, many underlying causes of a dynamic of growth not being sustained. There's political transitions that can cause growth to not be sustained. There's macro imbalances and macro crises that can cause growth to be sustained. There's a lack of an underlying transformation and productivity growth that can ultimately lead to fading growth and a lack of sustained growth. There's bad luck with terms of trade. So the causes of the lack of sustained growth are very wide, very varied, and that is what results in what we observe in the lack of general sustained growth in the developing world. Whereas sustainable growth is often very focused exclusively on the long run, as if the long run can be decomposed and separated from the series of short and medium runs. And it's usually associated with a relatively small number of things. So the key question, I think, for a conference on sustainable growth or around the development of sustainable growth is, if we imagine the universe of all the causes of the lack of sustained growth, which is and a lack of sustained growth results from a large and sustained growth deceleration if one is starting an episode of rapid growth over the next 10 years. Like, what are the possible reasons why we might not have sustained growth? The question is, how large is the set of sustainability issues in the set of sustained growth issues? And it's possible that the sustainable issues are relatively small set. could be the sustainable issues are a huge set. It could be that you're facing a country in which the sustained growth issues and the sustainability issues are very large. Or it could be that it's in fact very small. So that's my second main point is I believe the discussion of sustainability should start from the discussion of sustained growth. What does it take to sustain a process of rapid converging growth in the country? And then ask, of the threats to sustained growth, how large are the threats to sustainability per se? Now, I want to make two more points in just 10 minutes. The second is that if one goes back to the original Brundtland Commission definition of sustainability, it's meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. This is not a definition that says there's this distinct category of the environment or this distinct category of natural resources, and these natural resources or environmental goods need to be preserved. That's not what it says. What it says is the stock overall of productive assets needs to be preserved. That could involve, in fact, a depletion of the natural resources and an investment in other sources of productive assets. So we shouldn't confuse or conflate a preservationist around specific natural resources with the idea of sustainability. And I just want to show a set of wonderful images. It turns out Harvard, where I worked for a number of years, has a forest. Harvard literally owns a forest. And the story behind Harvard owning a forest is very interesting. And in this Harvard forest, they've done a study of what the forest looked like in the area around the forest. And not surprisingly, what happened is, and the graph is sort of going from very long ago on the upper north through history. What happened to the forest in Massachusetts around the Harvard forest is that originally it was this aboriginal forest, roughly untouched by human hands. When the white settlers got to Massachusetts, they engaged in a process of completely cutting down the forest. So the area around the Harvard forest went from thick original forest to be completely cleared by the early 1800s. So all of the forest resources were depleted. Then from the 1800 onwards, a process of agricultural and industrial transformation happened around Massachusetts such that this same area reforested. But it reforested in a way in which there were deliberate planting and human manipulation of the forest such that it grew a specific kind of wood, and there was a large industry of pine forest in the area of the Harvard forest. And eventually that gave way to a different forest, which was a hardwood forest, which was again completely planted and constructed. And then finally, the last lower southeast is the picture of the Harvard forest today, in which it's completely forest cover. And it's completely forest cover in a non-commercial, non-harvested way, because the relative importance of any forest resource to the economy of Massachusetts is absolutely nil. So the forest is no longer an economically relevant category, in which case the ground cover is covered with forest. So, was there a sustainable process of sustainability of the overall economy of Massachusetts? Yes, absolutely. Did that involve preserving the natural resources that were first encountered in Massachusetts? Absolutely not. They cut down all of the existing trees. So the middle diagrams are complete transformation from forest to agriculture, and then a transformation away from agriculture towards industry and towards now the modern, super postmodern economy of Massachusetts, in which Harvard has a forest that no one cares at all about, including the Harvard forest. So I just want to be clear that if you want to decide what an environmentally sustainable growth strategy is like, it involves some extraordinarily hard and super hard questions. The first is, what is the range of economic activities that the environmental good that you're talking about is productive and even essential to? So, timber is in fact essential to the production of timber, but it turns out timber stops being essential to the economy. Second is, what are the long-run dynamics of the resource, and particularly what's the recovery pattern of, the stock of anything is the flow in versus the flow out, and what is the overall dynamics of the stock. What one should be concerned about with sustainability is, are there catastrophic levels below which the recovery of the stock is no longer possible? With forest, it was possible to sort of deplete the resources entirely and then regrow the resource later. With other natural resource phenomena, that's not possible. And if one hits catastrophically low levels of that, the overall regeneration of the ecosystem collapses entirely. And then third, what are the returns to which the depletion of the resource is taken? So one can have sustainable overall growth without sustaining each individual resource. But that involves, if one cuts down the forest, one invests the result of cutting down the forest in new productive assets. If one cuts down the forest and steals all the money, one cuts down the forest and wastes all the money, then the overall process is unsustainable. But the point is, the unsustainability doesn't come from cutting down the forest. The unsustainability comes from not having invested that in a set of equally productive resources. So one shouldn't approach the dynamics of an economic sustainable growth process with the illusion that what that means is a stasis and a preservationist attitude. It's a, what are we doing to create the overall stock of productive assets, and are we maintaining an adequately necessary stock of productive assets for the future? So this therefore asks a focus of sustainability on an entirely different set of questions than just on, is the stock of this or that being depleted? So a fourth final point, and I'm making this very quickly because it's very straightforward, which is nothing about the carbon intensity of Pakistan's economic growth has anything to do with the impact of climate change on the Pakistani people. And this point is very straightforward and very simple and very obvious, but it somehow gets lost, and people act as if the sustainability of Pakistan's growth process with respect to carbon emissions is some key factor to Pakistan's experience of climate change. And it's just obviously not true, for the simple reason that if one looks at the global emissions, and climate change is a global process of transforming climate, here are the major emitters of CO2 in the world, and you see in this graph, Pakistan isn't there. And Pakistan isn't there because it's not in the top 25 countries in the world in terms of its total emissions. And here is just another graphic representation of the decomposition of total CO2 emissions by individual country, and you see that Pakistan is one of the countries in the red. But it's also obvious from this graph that, if Pakistan went to zero emissions, the total change in CO2 would be very minor. Pakistan accounts for less than 0.5% of all emissions in the world. And by the same token, if Pakistan doubled its emissions, the likelihood that would have any impact on the global process of climate change is slim to none. It just isn't that big, which means that if I was worried about the sustainability of Pakistan's growth, the last thing due to climate change, the last thing I would be worried about is Pakistan's carbon emissions. They're just not a big deal with respect, which isn't to say that Pakistan might not be dramatically affected by climate change. Pakistan may well be dramatically affected by climate change, but whether or not Pakistan is dramatically affected by climate change is completely separate from the question of what Pakistan does about its own carbon emissions. So if I were worried about climate change as a process and how it affected the sustainability of Pakistan's growth, I might be very worried about it, but maybe the least important thing to be done about the sustainability of Pakistan's growth with respect to climate change is worry about Pakistan's own carbon emissions, which is a paradoxical position, but technically that is in fact the case. So those are the 4 points I wanted to make. Growth is essential to human well-being. Sustained growth is a much broader and more important concept than the sustainability set of issues that are focused. Third, The sustainability set of issues is a much more complicated question than a simple preservation of natural resources or preservation of environmental assets, of which they're only a subset of the total productive assets of an economy. And the sustainability issue is around the total productive stock of assets, which could involve some substitution among types of assets. And in fact, the development process has always involved radical changes in the importance of relative types of assets. And fourth, that climate change as a sustainability issue as it affects Pakistan is about what will climate change do to Pakistan, but what climate change does to Pakistan has nothing to do with what Pakistan does about climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Pritchett, for a very, very deep insight into issues of sustained growth and sustainability. And I'm sure all the students sitting in the hall and the faculty members have greatly benefited from this tension of ideas, I would say, that you have generated through this debate. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to take the liberty of posing one or two quick queries, which might also reflect the concerns of the audience also, because we are running behind schedule, and Pakistan has to learn to do that better also. I'm sorry to admit that, but since, you know, this is a very valuable keynote that you have delivered. However, I'll begin with the last slide that you made the point that Pakistan is not, obviously not a contributor to the global carbon emissions, but is still a big victim of the impacts of climate change. And that is very, very evident in the form of the flooding that we have seen, in which almost 2/3 of Pakistan's land is underwater. So this builds the case for climate financing. And I would just like you to, you know, briefly give your views on how do we, you know, make a case based on this argument for a global move towards climate financing to help strengthen the growth trajectory of countries like Pakistan. This is the first question. If you would like to answer that, I will then pose just one more question. Thank you.
So I guess the only answer to that question is just keep repeating, you know, the inconvenient truth over and over and over and over again, which is, you know, Al Gore, who was the vice president of the United States, and, you know, likes to talk about the inconvenient truth about climate change. But the true inconvenient truth for the West is that what the West now wants to do through its development agency and its domination of the global intellectual agenda is to push the onus for solving climate change onto the countries themselves, rather than admit that the flooding in Pakistan was not caused in any way, shape, or form, to the extent that it's attributable to climate change. And I don't know the particulars of it, but I assume that it was. It was nothing Pakistan did cause the floods. It was the cumulative emissions of Europe and the United States that caused the climate change that we're experiencing today. Nothing to do, and again, this graph in terms of cumulative stocks of CO2 would look even more dramatic. So again, I don't know exactly how to be effective at this, but one way to be effective at this process of persuasion on climate change is just to keep repeating that climate change is a problem affecting Pakistan, not and never caused by Pakistan. And so the onus of solving climate change globally should not be put on Pakistan, but neither should Pakistan be made to bear the weight of, alone as a country, the consequence of a global process caused by the emissions of others. How one repeats that, I mean, and I say that because I feel that the West's domination of the agenda leads many in Pakistan to act as if Pakistan's challenge about climate change is reducing its own carbon emissions. So they're internalizing, in some sense, the mental model of the West, that since the challenge is to solve climate change looking forward, each country has to reduce its own carbon emissions and get on a green path. And so 90% or 99% of the sustainability around climate change agenda is dominated by what countries need to do about their own carbon emissions, and 1% is about climate finance. Whereas from Pakistan's and global justice point of view, it should be 90% about climate finance and 10% about what Pakistan is going to do. And so I don't know how to be more effective at this, but one of the things is more people in Pakistan and more consistently all Pakistanis should be pushing back against the view that Pakistan should be completely on its own to solve the problems created for the sustainability of Pakistan's existence, Pakistan's not having floods, Pakistan not having droughts, Pakistan's future should be borne solely by Pakistan for a problem that was created by the historical process of emissions of fundamentally North America and Europe. So I just think in all global forum, refusing to take blame that doesn't belong on them for the future and being correct about the responsibility of the West to help Pakistan solve the threats to Pakistan from climate change is just essential and needs to not succumb to the temptation of the finance around climate change is exclusively around, again, trying to make Pakistan seem as if they're a culpable partner.
Thank you, Dr. Pritchett. I think the message is well taken. And even though we have to be vocal about this issue, we also have to brace ourselves for the impact of climate change.
Absolutely.
No matter whether we are contributors or not. And that is where Pakistan is seriously now trying to devote its energies to, because it does impact both growth and human development outcomes in the end. Just one short question. Your thoughts about the SDG agenda, and that is because obviously you have made a very strong case for economic development and economic growth not being sort of traded off at the altar of sustainable development. But obviously you did not imply that, pursuing the SDG agenda was a futile exercise. So just to make this point clearer to the student audience sitting here, since they're going to hear a lot about the SDGs, and the university is also going to announce a center for SDGs at the end of this conference. The students would like to hear your views about that. Thank you.
So I think there's two ways. So one thing every student should always understand is the rhetoric they receive needs to be analyzed and decomposed and understood for the rhetoric that it is, right? And all international rhetoric involves an enormous amount of what we call constructive ambiguity. In order to reach global agreements, one needs a significant amount of constructive ambiguity. Well, what does constructive ambiguity mean? Constructive ambiguity means we're both going to say the same words and mean radically different things by them. So the SDGs are a global diplomatic exercise in constructive ambiguity, in which the West agreed to say some things, Pakistan and other countries in the South agreed to say some things, and both use the word sustainable development and mean radically different things by them. I feel what the countries like Pakistan meant by sustainable development is we want the development that you have. The SDGs from the Millennium Development Goals, the SDGs are a radically broader agenda for the global South, a radically equalizing agenda for the global South. They refuse to continue to accept the very penurious and low bar MDGs. They wanted a radically higher set of standards, and that was embodied in the SDGs. So the truly radical thing from Pakistan's point of view about the SDGs is how radically ambitious the agenda is for Pakistan. Countries like Pakistan said, we're not going to accept, having these very low bar goals. We want the same goals as Europe, as the North America, as Japan, as et cetera. And so in some ways, the sustainable goals are radically liberating the countries from Pakistan to not accept low targets, to not accept anything other than exactly the same levels of human well-being that the West now enjoy. So that, in my mind, was the truly radical nature of the SDGs. What the West wanted out of it was to everybody use the word sustainable about it. And the West meant one thing by sustainable, and they were concerned with their own agenda. So if I were a Pakistani student, I would say the SDGs provide a framework for Pakistan to think about achieving radically higher development goals for Pakistan in a sustained way. And that would be our interpretation of sustainable development. And that the West wants to talk about environment and climate change. Hey, that's their own business. That was the compromise we made in order to get to agreement. So again, I wouldn't accept the West's interpretation of what the sustainable development goals mean as my starting point.
Okay. I'm sorry, Dr. Lant, that we will have to beg leave now.
Well, it's 1:30 in the morning where I am, so I'm not completely sorry we have to break off.
I'm so sorry for that. Where are you?
No, I am in the West, the far West of the United States. So, but I'm super happy to join my friends in Pakistan at whatever time.
Okay, okay. And we have a tradition of presenting mementos to our distinguished speakers. However, since we cannot do that virtually, I promise that we will try to get your memento across to you, which is just a token of remembrance from the university to your intellectual scholarship and input for the students here. And maybe to pursue this discussion, the Fatma Jinnah Women University Economics Department can arrange a future lecture in your honor, and you can interact more with the students at that time. So with that, on behalf of the students and the faculty of the Department of Economics, as well as the Fatma Jinnah Women University, I thank you profusely for your time and your energy in explaining this nexus between sustained growth and sustainability. And I'm sure that Pakistan needs to take note of its the need for renewed emphasis on growth, because it's very, very troubling to hear statements coming from the top leadership that, Pakistan's growth rate is going to be downgraded to 2% because of the floods. And well, that is a calamity that we cannot avoid, but still, we need to be more cautious about even making these statements, because with being the fifth most populous country in the world, we cannot afford to survive on a 2% growth rate. Even if we are hit by calamities, we have to do better in terms of that. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for inviting me, and I hope to someday come by and accept the memento in person, and be happy to accept future invitations to be there. I just couldn't be there for these particular dates. But
thank you. You're most welcome.
Come to Pakistan.
And
thank you.
Have a direct interaction. Good night. Have
Good
a
night. Good. Okay, bye.